In June 1942, the Arctic Ocean looked like a graveyard. The wind screamed across endless sheets of ice, and the sun never truly set. It just hung there, pale and distant, over a sea that killed by degrees. Into this frozen silence sailed 35 merchant ships, their hulls heavy with tanks, planes, and food, the lifeblood of the Soviet front. Their mission: to reach Murmansk. Their name? Convoy PQ-17. The men who boarded those ships knew what awaited them. They'd heard of the convoys before them, shattered by U-boats, burned by Luftwaffe fire. They'd seen the photographs of ships sinking into black water, men turning to ice before rescue boats could reach them. Still, they went, because war leaves no room for hesitation, only duty. The convoy set out under the midnight sun. Ice cracked against the hulls, engines groaned, and frost crept into every corner of the steel ships. Men chipped ice from ropes with bare hands until their fingers bled. They worked in silence, surrounded by fog so thick it swallowed sound. Each dawn brought no warmth, only the echo of the Arctic wind and the knowledge that somewhere out there, unseen, the enemy was watching. Above the clouds, German reconnaissance planes circled like carrion birds. Beneath the waves, the gray shapes of U-boats moved in silence. And somewhere far away, in a Norwegian fjord, waited the most feared ship in the Atlantic, the battleship Tirpitz. Its guns were large enough to tear a convoy apart in minutes. To the men of PQ-17, it was a ghost story made of steel. But in London, the Admiralty was confident. "Escort will hold," they said. "The Tirpitz will not sail." So the convoy pushed forward. 2,000 men, 35 ships, one fragile promise of survival. The first attacks came on July 1st. A shadow in the fog, then another. Bombs screamed down through the mist. Torpedoes sliced through the freezing water, and the Arctic exploded in fire. Men ran to guns with frost-bitten hands. Shells clanged against ice-covered decks, and voices shouted through the wind, drowned by the thunder of explosions. One ship vanished in seconds, then another. Still, they held formation. Still, they believed in the escort that shielded them. Each night, as the temperature dropped below zero, they counted the lights of the ships still afloat. 35 became 33, then 30, and then came the message that changed everything. On the evening of July 4th, a signal arrived from the Admiralty. "Enemy surface ships have left port. Scatter." The captains read it twice, stunned. Scatter? That meant every ship for itself. No formation, no defense, just survival. And so the Arctic became chaos. Ships turned in all directions, breaking the line that had kept them safe. Within hours, German bombers swooped down again, hunting the isolated targets like wolves among sheep. The sea burned. Oil and ice mixed into one black mass. Men clung to wreckage, their lips frozen shut, watching the sky for help that would never come. When dawn rose again, the Arctic was silent. Of 35 ships, most were gone. Only a handful continued north, limping through the fog, engines dying, decks coated in ice and ash. The rest drifted beneath the surface, their cargo of tanks and ammunition now sleeping in the coldest grave on Earth. Later, survivors would say the worst sound wasn't the bombs or the guns. It was the radio silence afterward, the emptiness where voices used to be. They had sailed to deliver hope. But in the Arctic, hope froze faster than steel. By the evening of July 4th, 1942, the Arctic was quiet, too quiet. The sea, once raging, had calmed to a glassy stillness that made the men uneasy. Somewhere beyond the fog, they knew, The enemy waited. But it wasn't the Germans who would destroy PQ-17. It was a message, one that came from their own side. That night, the convoy's radios came alive with static. Through the white noise, a signal broke. Enemy surface ships have left port. Scatter immediately. At first, captains stared at the message in disbelief. They checked the encryption twice. The order was real. It came directly from the Admiralty in London. Scatter, one commander whispered. That means we're alone. The escort ships, British destroyers and cruisers, turned east. They had been ordered to withdraw, to protect themselves from what was believed to be an approaching German fleet led by the Tirpitz. In that instant, 35 merchant ships were abandoned in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, without cover, without defense, and without hope. For the men on the merchant vessels, the realization hit like ice in the veins. One by one, they watched their escorts disappear into the fog, the destroyers that had been their shield now fading into the gray. The sea, once crowded with engines and radio chatter, fell silent. Some captains hesitated. Others followed the order, breaking formation and setting out alone through a sea crawling with U-boats and bombers. Within hours, the convoy dissolved into chaos, scattered lines of smoke stretching across hundreds of miles of frozen water. The decision had been made in London, far from the ice, based on intercepted messages that were never confirmed. The Admiralty believed the Tirpitz was moving to intercept PQ-17, but it wasn't. The mighty battleship remained anchored in a fjord. And yet, its ghost was enough to destroy an entire convoy. As the ships scattered, the Germans moved in. From the north came Luftwaffe bombers, streaking low across the horizon. Their torpedoes ripped through the icy sea, finding targets easily among the isolated ships. From beneath the waves, U-boats surfaced, their periscopes glinting in the dim Arctic light. The chase began, slow, methodical, merciless. "Ship to port hit," crackled one transmission. Moments later, another voice. "Engines gone. Abandoning ship." Then silence. The sea burned. Oil fires spread across the ice, glowing like false dawn. Men leapt into lifeboats, their hands frozen to the oars, eyes blinded by snow and smoke. The air stank of fuel, fear, and death. Those who weren't killed by bombs soon froze in the water, bodies turning to stone beneath drifting ice. By midnight, the Arctic was a graveyard. The radio waves were filled with desperate calls for help, and no answers. The escorts were gone. The command had moved on. And the men of PQ-17 were left to die in silence. Historians would later call it one of the most tragic miscommunications in naval history. But for the sailors clinging to lifeboats in the endless cold, it wasn't history, it was hell, unfolding second by second. They had followed orders, and the order had led them straight into the abyss. When the convoy scattered, the Arctic stopped being an ocean. It became a hunting ground. The sea was calm, but beneath that calmness lurked death. German U-boats rose like shadows from the depths, their periscopes slicing through the fog. Above, the sky trembled under the sound of bomber engines. The once united convoy PQ-17, 35 merchant ships carrying tanks, planes, and weapons for the Soviet front, was now broken into terrified fragments drifting through the ice. The men on board had no protection. Their escorting cruisers and destroyers were gone, retreating east under Admiralty orders. Each captain now faced the same impossible truth. They were alone in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, surrounded hunted, and utterly defenseless. At 02A on July 5, 1942, the first ship was hit. A single torpedo, then a flash, and the sky turned white with fire. The Christopher Newport was gone in seconds. Survivors barely had time to grab lifeboats before the sea swallowed the ship whole. The water boiled with oil and flame. And then, silence. Hours later, the bombers arrived. German Heinkel U-111s and Junkers 88s dove from the clouds, releasing their payloads with surgical precision. Explosions echoed across the horizon, one after another, until the Arctic itself seemed to burn. The water turned black with oil. Ice melted and refroze around floating debris, wooden crates, bodies, and lifeboats spinning in slow circles. The scene was chaos, but to the Germans, it was a massacre. From below, U-boats fired torpedoes into the scattered ships. No need for stealth, no need for strategy. They called it Das große Jagen, the Great Hunt. Each ship was an easy target, each explosion another success report. Radio messages from U-boat command read coldly, "Target destroyed. Flames visible for 10 kilometers. No survivors sighted." Above, Luftwaffe pilots flew low enough to see faces on deck. They described men waving their arms, trying to signal surrender. But no one spared them. Every ship had to die. The orders were simple, no mercy. The merchant sailors fought anyway. Some stayed at their guns, firing blindly into the clouds until bombs tore through the decks. Others manned pumps, trying to stop the flooding, even as ice-cold seawater reached their knees. When ships went under, survivors scrambled onto rafts or floating wreckage, their hands burning from the cold. Some tried to row toward distant smoke, only to realize it wasn't rescue, but another ship burning. "The sea was on fire," wrote one British sailor later, "and the ice was black from the smoke. We thought we'd gone to hell, only hell was frozen." By July 6th, the Arctic night glowed orange from the burning ships. Radio signals became desperate. Hartlebury, torpedoed, crew abandoning ship. Silver Sword hit, heavy casualties. "Any escort, any help, please respond." No one answered. The British escort fleet was hundreds of miles away, waiting for the phantom Tirpitz that never came. The order to scatter had doomed them all. Of the 35 ships that had left Iceland full of supplies and hope, nearly 25 were gone by dawn. Each one carried a small piece of the Allied war effort: tanks, planes, ammunition, all now sinking slowly to the ocean floor. The Arctic was swallowing the war itself. The surviving sailors drifted through the smoke, whispering prayers that froze in the air before they reached heaven. They huddled together in lifeboats, faces covered in frost, surrounded by oil and debris. In the endless daylight of the Arctic summer, there was nowhere to hide. The sun revealed everything: the burning ships, the floating corpses, and the quiet horror of defeat. By dawn on July 7th, the Arctic Ocean was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. What had once been the proud Convoy PQ-17, 35 merchant ship bound for Murmansk, was now scattered wreckage drifting between fields of ice. The sea was flat, silent, and deadly cold. Smoke hung low over the horizon like a funeral shroud. Everywhere you looked, pieces of wood, empty lifeboats, and the still shapes of men who hadn't survived the night. Those who had escaped the explosions now faced something worse: time. The hours dragged on like days. The cold ate through every layer of clothing, every ounce of strength. Water froze inside boots. Hands stuck to oars. Salt turned to glass on faces and eyebrows. When men spoke, their words came out as white mist. and then nothing. "We waited for the sun," one survivor wrote later, "but all it brought was light to see how many of us were left." On the crippled Empire Byron, Captain Dalzell had refused to surrender. Even as the deck tilted and the engines died, he ordered the men to stay at their guns. They fired until the barrels glowed orange and the air reeked of oil and cordite. When the final bomb struck, the ship erupted like a torch. Witnesses said the crew didn't jump. They simply vanished into the flame. Another ship, Hartlebury, was hit twice in 10 minutes. The blast tore the bow open, and the sea poured in like molten lead. Some men leapt into the water, only to find it burning. The surface coated in fire from ruptured fuel tanks. Those who escaped the blaze froze before rescue could reach them. Their hands still gripped the sides of overturned rafts, their eyes open, covered in frost. The Arctic gave them no mercy. In the chaos, a few ships still tried to form up, half blind, their radios failing, their maps useless. They didn't yet know the convoy was gone. They called into the static again and again. "Hartlebury under attack. Any response?" Empire Tide requesting escort coordinates. "Visibility 0, position unknown." No one answered. The messages went out into the frozen air and vanished, unheard. Day blurred into night, though the Arctic sun never truly set. Men drifted through endless daylight, surrounded by a sea of ghosts. Some shared chocolate rations, others tore pages from logbooks to write final notes, names, dates, fragments of prayers. Many simply stared into the horizon, eyes glazed, lips blue, waiting for the end. "The silence was so complete," wrote one British gunner, "that I thought I'd gone deaf until I realized the sea had killed even the wind." In London, the first telegrams arrived quietly. One line at a time, the story unfolded. And it wasn't a battle report. It was a death toll. Ship missing. No survivors. Convoy destroyed. When the Admiralty realized the Tirpitz had never even left harbor, the room fell completely silent. The order to scatter, meant to save the convoy, had doomed it instead. They had sent men into the Arctic to die for an illusion. Winston Churchill read the report in disbelief. He paused only once, murmuring, "The most bitter chapter of the sea war." To the sailors who had lived it, that was an understatement. They didn't call it a chapter. They called it betrayal, by fear, by leadership, by the very command that left them alone in the cold. Weeks later, Soviet patrols along the Kola Peninsula began to find the remains. Crates frozen solid in blocks of ice. A lifeboat half buried in snow, its oars still upright. Inside, 6 men seated neatly in a row, hands folded, faces calm. They hadn't drowned. They had simply stopped moving. Another discovery came weeks later, a crate stamped "For Murmansk, urgent." Inside were tins of meat, perfectly preserved, and a handwritten manifest. At the bottom, someone had scrawled in pencil, "If this reaches land, tell them we tried." When the Arctic finally released what was left of PQ-17, only 11 ships reached port. The rest, 24 vessels and hundreds of men, had vanished into the sea. Their cargoes of tanks, ammunition, aircraft, and food lay rusting beneath the ice. And for a long time, London said nothing. In the British press, the headlines were muted. "Convoy faces difficulties," one read. "Losses reported." But in truth, it was one of the greatest naval disasters in history. And the Admiralty knew it. Inside the War Office, reports were burned, rewritten, and buried under classified stamps. No one wanted to admit that a single mistaken order had destroyed an entire fleet. In Moscow, the reaction was different. The Soviets had been waiting for those supplies to reach Murmansk. When Stalin heard the news, his anger was immediate and cold. He demanded to know why the British had abandoned the convoy in mid-ocean. The message from the Kremlin was clear. Your fear of the German fleet cost us weapons, men, and faith. For the first time, Churchill felt the alliance tremble. He wrote in his diary that the loss of PQ-17 struck like a knife through the heart of the Arctic lifeline. The Soviet front was bleeding, and now the North Atlantic had failed them too. At sea, survivors continued to arrive in fragments. One lifeboat here, two sailors there. They were pulled from the water by Norwegian trawlers and Russian patrol ships, half dead, unrecognizable. Their skin was wax white, their eyes sunken, their clothes stiff with salt. Some could no longer speak. Others mumbled coordinates, names, prayers. When they were finally brought ashore, they wept not from pain, but from disbelief that the world was still warm. One sailor later said, "When I saw a fire burning on land, I didn't feel joy. I felt fear, because I thought it was another ship going down." In Archangel, the survivors were treated as ghosts, men who had been erased and then returned by the sea. Doctors recorded cases of blindness from cold, frost-bitten lungs and hallucinations caused by exhaustion. Some had been adrift for over a week. A few didn't even remember their names. In London, a secret inquiry began. The question was simple. Who gave the order to scatter? Admiral Dudley Pound took responsibility, though even he admitted he'd acted out of fear of Tirpitz. That ship, the great Phantom of the North, had never even left its fjord. The Admiralty's mistake had killed more men than the German Navy ever could. When Pound died the next year, some called it poetic justice. Others said it was just the war devouring another man. The tragedy of PQ-17 was buried in bureaucracy. Official statements spoke of heavy ice and adverse weather. No one mentioned panic, miscommunication, or human error. The sailors who returned were told not to talk about what they'd seen. Their story, the chaos, the screams, the cold, stayed locked inside for decades. But the Arctic remembered. Each summer, Soviet trawlers still reported glimpses of metal on the seabed. Twisted hulls, rusted gun barrels, names barely visible through the silt, and sometimes a lifeboat, empty but still afloat. "The Arctic doesn't give back what it takes," one Russian captain said years later. "It just holds it a little longer." When the war ended, only a handful of the PQ-17 sailors were still alive. Many refused medals. They didn't see heroism, only loss. For them, the convoy was not about courage or sacrifice, but about silence. The silence of radios, of leaders, of the frozen sea itself. For decades, PQ-17 was little more than a whisper. Officially, it was an unfortunate event. In classrooms, museums, and documentaries, the story was shortened to a single line: a convoy attacked by German forces. No mention of the panic, the order to scatter, or the men who froze waiting for rescue that never came. It was as if the Arctic had swallowed not just ships, but truth itself. In the 1950s, the wrecks were rediscovered, faint sonar echoes rising from the ocean floor near Novaya Zemlya. Diver reports described a forest of metal, ships standing upright in the sand, their masts draped in seaweed. On some decks, helmets still lay where they had fallen. Inside the holds, crates marked for USSR, urgent, were sealed shut, perfectly preserved by the cold. Time had done what war could not. It kept everything exactly as it was the moment the sea closed over them. It was like entering a frozen moment of terror, said one Russian diver. Everything was there, except life. For years, both Britain and the Soviet Union avoided talking about PQ-17. It was politically inconvenient, a reminder of fear, misjudgment, and human failure. The Cold War made the silence even deeper. Former allies became rivals, and the graves in the Arctic became no one's responsibility. But the sailors who survived never forgot. In veterans' meetings, they spoke quietly among themselves about the screams in the fog, the empty horizon, the sound of engines fading into ice. Some never set foot on a ship again. Others wrote memoirs decades later, their hands shaking as they tried to remember details through the haze of guilt and frostbite. "We didn't die," one wrote, "but part of us stayed out there, floating in the cold." In the 1970s, a British historian finally broke the silence. Using declassified naval logs and survivor accounts, he reconstructed the events of those days. For the first time, the truth reached the public. PQ-17 hadn't been defeated by the Germans. It had been destroyed by fear. The revelation caused outrage. Admirals were dead, archives closed, and the story had already fossilized into myth. But for the few remaining sailors, it wasn't anger they felt, it was relief. Someone had finally spoken their truth aloud. In 1988, a memorial was built on the cliffs of Reykjavik, overlooking the North Atlantic. A bronze figure of a sailor stands facing north, his hand shielding his eyes from the eternal Arctic wind. The inscription reads simply, "To those who sailed the Arctic route and did not return." Every winter, survivors gathered there. They stood in silence, the wind cutting across their faces as if the sea still demanded attention. When the last of them died, their ashes were scattered into those same waters, the same route, the same cold, the same unending silence. Today, satellites still pass over the wrecks of PQ-17, buried beneath ice and time. They lie 12,000 feet below, in perfect darkness. No waves, no sound, only the slow drift of silt over iron. And yet, something about that place remains alive. Every now and then, a Russian fishing crew reports strange echoes on sonar, long metallic shapes rising and fading beneath the surface. Maybe it's the current, maybe it's memory. In the years after the war, the Arctic route was closed and PQ-17 faded from memory. The ships rusted beneath the ice. The men were buried or forgotten, and the story became just another footnote in the chronicles of global conflict. But among sailors, especially those who knew the North, PQ-17 remained a whisper of warning. "The sea doesn't forgive fear," they said. "It smells it." The lessons of that convoy were studied in every naval academy that came after. Commanders learned that hesitation kills faster than any torpedo. That leadership demands not just courage, but calm, even in chaos. PQ-17 became a case study in how one order, given in panic, can doom hundreds. But beyond strategy, there was something deeper. It wasn't about ships or tactics. It was about men, cold, starving, terrified, still choosing to row, to fight, to hope, even when the ocean turned against them. Decades later, when historians revisited the Arctic campaign, they realized something extraordinary. Despite the disaster, the convoys didn't stop. After PQ-17, others followed, PQ-18, JW-51, RA-55, and they made it through. The sailors returned to the same route, the same deadly sea, and kept sailing, because the war still needed them, because giving up wasn't an option. That persistence became the quiet legacy of PQ-17, not the panic of its commanders, but the endurance of its men. Ordinary people in extraordinary cold, fighting not for glory, but simply to keep moving forward. Courage, wrote one survivor, isn't shouting over the storm. It's whispering to yourself that you'll make it to the next wave. In the end, PQ-17 wasn't just a convoy that died in the Arctic. It was a mirror held up to humanity, showing both its failures and its strength. The ice revealed what war truly is. Not a clash of armies, but a test of endurance, trust, and will. And though the convoy was lost, its story outlived every admiral, every government, every excuse. Today, when ships cross those same waters under the northern lights, their radar sometimes catches faint echoes beneath the waves. The steel bones of PQ-17 still lie there, silent, cold, but undefeated in memory. Each winter, the ice shifts, cracks, and closes again over their names. And in that endless dark, history keeps whispering, they were here. They tried. And that was enough.